Before we talk about structures, I want to talk about what respiration is. Respiration is the exchange between the body and the environment of gases. So this is separated into two different types of respiration. We have external respiration. This is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the air and the blood that happens in the lungs. So this is breathing the air into the lungs and then exchanging it with the blood. Internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and body tissues. So let's look at the structures. The most important structure that we need to know about is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is what initiates respiration. So what happens is the diaphragm is a muscle, and when it contracts, it creates negative pressure, meaning the air pressure outside of the body is greater than inside the body. This causes air to come into the lungs, and that's how we breathe in. If we want to breathe in more deeply, we can actually contract the muscles between the ribs, which creates a greater negative pressure, and it brings more air in. On the flip side, if we want to breathe out, the muscle relaxes, the diaphragm muscle relaxes, and it pushes up, shrinking the cavity, making the pressure greater inside the body than outside. And if we want to blow out more forcefully, say to blow up a balloon, our muscles between our ribs can contract, increasing the pressure, and it allows us to breathe out more forcefully. So now the first step in breathing in is taking air from the outside and start bringing it into the body. So we have two areas that we bring air into the body from. First is the nasal cavity. Now, if you look at this nasal cavity, notice we have grooves here. What that does is it gives a lot of surface area. In our nose, we have hair called cilia, and we have mucus. The point of having those is it collects debris and pathogens before they get into our respiratory system. An additional benefit is it also warms and moistens the air before it gets into the lungs. Now we can also breathe in through the mouth. The mouth does not have these same type of protective measures. We have the tonsils in the back of our throat, which will collect some pathogens, and that's why they are there. But we have less filtering happen when we breathe in through the mouth. This is why when I'm around people who are sick, I tend to breathe in through my nose more because the air is being filtered more thoroughly. The next part is the pharynx, which is just the back of the throat. So we have both the nasal cavity and the mouth cavity breathe in air, and they collect at the pharynx. After the pharynx, it goes down into the larynx. Larynx is also called the voice box. And so the way we make sound is we have this opening and we have two bands of connective tissue that work very similar to a string, like on a stringed instrument. And so if we want to make our voices higher, we need to contract the muscles on either side of these bands of tissue and make them thinner, just like the thinner strings on a guitar. And all of a sudden, your voice gets really high. On the flip side, if we want to shrink down and get a lower tone, we relax those muscles and the band gets thicker, and all of a sudden we get much deeper voices. And that's how we control the tone of our voice. And that's the voice box. Now, before we go down to the trachea, we also have what they call the epiglottis, which is a flap of tissue that actually covers up the way into the respiratory system. So when we eat, we don't have food going down into the respiratory system. And that's called the epiglottis. Next we have is the trachea. Now the trachea if we didn't have this, the trachea could potentially collapse, making it so we couldn't breathe. And so this is why we have cartilage to help the airway stay open. Now, as we come down the trachea, which is also known as the windpipe, we branch off onto what they call bronchi. Now, think about similar to our blood flow is as we go from a larger diameter vessel to a thinner, it increases pressure, which allows air to flow more quickly into our lungs. And so we have the bronchi, which are the first branches. Then we branch off into what we call the bronchioles, which are the next smaller area for air to go to. Okay, these both flow into the lungs. So we go trachea, bronchi go into the lungs, and the bronchioles are the next smaller ones. Now here's our two lungs. Notice how the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2. What you'll also notice is the left lung will tend to be shorter and wider versus the right lung. And this is because it has to make room for the heart. And so the heart is tucked in right here. And that's why the shapes are a little bit different. All the lungs are is they're tissues that expand and work like balloons, and they fill up with air, allowing oxygen and carbon dioxide to be exchanged with the blood. And then they get contracted by the relax of the diaphragm, which breathes out carbon dioxide. Now, how does oxygen get into the blood and carbon dioxide come out? That is through the alveoli. So if we go back to what we just learned about circulatory system, red means artery, which is blood coming from the heart. This is deoxygenated blood. This is blood that has more carbon dioxide than oxygen. So what happens is it goes over the alveoli, which are little sacs. And since there is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide on the red blood cells, and there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the lungs, they exchange, and so carbon dioxide is released into the lungs or into these sacs, and oxygen is connected to the hemoglobin on the red blood cells. Then it collects into the veins and goes back to the heart to be circulated through the body. And that's how alveoli, notice how they are balloon-like. It allows for more surface area, so you can have more capillaries, and so you have a better exchange of gases. Okay, and then let's talk about problems with the respiratory system. First one is bronchitis. And like we talked about earlier in the semester, is when you put itis at the end of something, it means inflammation. So this is inflammation of the bronchioles. This is usually caused due to an infection or an exposure to irritants such as tobacco smoke, air pollution, and even certain chemicals. Next, we have pneumonia. Pneumonia is inflammation of the lungs, commonly caused by a bacteria or viral infection. Now, this is dangerous because when we have an infection in the lungs, it causes fluid buildup. Now, our respiratory system is not meant to deal with fluid in the lungs. And so, this is really hard. This is really bad because what it does is it allows for infection to grow when we have fluid in the lungs, and it can get worse and worse. Next, we have pleurisy. Pleurisy is the inflammation of the lining of the lungs between the chest cavity. So, if you think we have our ribs over the top of our lungs, and the lungs are constantly expanding when the diaphragm contracts and we breathe in air, and relaxing. If we didn't have a coating around it, is there'd be so much friction that it would damage the tissue of the lungs. So the pleurisy is a lining around the chest cavity that actually allows lubrication and free movement of the lungs and decreases the friction. Now this is pleurisy is inflammation, so every time you breathe in, you'd feel it and it's painful. Next is asthma. Asthma is an inflammation of the bronchioles and the bronchi. This is usually caused, it's a stress response, usually. And so what happens is these inflame and they constrict. And so what happens is it shrinks the airway, so it's harder to breathe. Sinusitis is inflammation of the sinus cavity, usually called a sinus infection. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection of the respiratory system, is highly contagious. And so when I worked in San Diego, is I had to go get a TB test before I could work with any students because it's contagious and it can actually damage the growth of the lungs. Then finally, we have emphysema. Emphysema is characterized by shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and a chronic cough. The best way to simulate emphysema and to understand how it feels is to put a straw in your mouth and try to breathe through it. Because we have a progressive deterioration of alveoli, and so we cannot exchange gases as well. And that's what emphysema is usually a side effect of smoking. So let's talk about care for the respiratory system. First is we want to avoid smoking because smoking, especially in adolescence, can actually decrease lung growth. And so we have a long-term effect. Additionally, we want to avoid vaping because we talked about previously the respiratory system is not meant to have moisture in the lungs. And so what happens is we are breathing in a vapor, which is evaporated. Well, then as it gets into the body, it can condense and it creates a moist environment, which allows bacteria to grow and thrive, and it can lead to infection. We want to increase exercise. This helps increase lung volume. It also can stimulate the growth of more alveoli and more capillaries on the alveoli so we can exchange gases more efficiently. We want to wash our hands regularly. That way, we are not introducing any sort of foreign pathogens into the respiratory system because it is very fragile. We want to avoid air pollution and other type of irritants that can aggravate the respiratory tissue. Now, this is poignant right now because of what we are combating as a country. Corona is a respiratory condition, and so if it gets into our lungs, it can lead to pneumonia type symptoms, and that's why it is actually relatively deadly. Is because of that is how it affects the respiratory system. Okay, now that is the end of the respiratory system. This should give you the last part of chapter 16. It'll give you about a third of the answers for the worksheet we're on. Okay, if you have any questions, make sure to email me and watch out for my next chapter 17 presentation. That'll be coming at you later this week. Take care.